Spy Cops Info Podcast. A series on the secret undercover political police who spied on over 1,000 campaign groups since 1968. Hashtag Spy Cops Pod. Episode 13, Media Coverage, with Morning Star journalist Bethany Rielly. Welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast. I'm Tom Fowler, and today I'm joined with
Bethany Rielly, reporter at the Morning Star.
Thanks for joining us. In the coverage of the inquiry and even the issue generally, there are very few journalists who've been following it. I mean, obviously Rob Evans of The Guardian's been following it since the early days, but other than that, you are the only journalist who's been to every hearing of the inquiry. And that's a unique position. This issue doesn't get much media coverage generally, and you're kind of responsible for almost 50% of the coverage.
It feels like a big responsibility.
Does it feel like a big responsibility?
Yeah, I suppose it does, because, a lot of campaigners who have had their lives turned upside down by this, they want people to know what happened to them so that things can change. So a lot of people have come to me and said, thank you for coming to all of these inquiries, and that does feel like a bit of responsibility. But it mostly just makes me feel a bit disappointed in my sector, in my industry. But also I do understand, there's a lot of pressures on different media publications, and the ability for journalists to be able to cover an inquiry from start to finish is so limited now. I mean, you don't get anyone really doing court reporting anymore because it's just not and an inquiry is a similar thing, similar limitations.
I mean, it's certainly for the way it's structured. It's on from 10:30 to 4:30. They're huge publishing of large numbers of PDF files, whilst it doesn't really fit with as I understand it, you have to file for the paper by early afternoon.
Yeah.
So if the story comes out at the inquiry late on in the day, that's no good to you.
No, unless I can do a really quick turnaround. But yeah, I would have to identify the angle early on and work on it. Otherwise, it's and then I miss a lot of big things that happen later on in the day. Also, like you said, it's a massive information dump every day. So you don't get access to any of the witness statements or any of the evidence linked to the undercover police officers and the campaigners and court participants. So you sort of have one eye on the witness in front of you, and then another eye looking through these police documents and looking through the witness statements, trying to sort of piece everything together for this report. A lot of things then are missed, and I don't know if that's something that's done quite purposefully or...
It's been a few months since the last phase of the inquiry. The Undercover Research Group is still discovering things from that information dump because nobody's had time to go through it all. But then the problem, of course, that for you is as a print journalist is that it's not topical now. It was topical when it first came out, but it's no good you filing a story on information that's just been discovered from that now. Yeah,
I mean, you can try to do that, to wrangle it in somehow, if you do a contemporary interview with someone and try to tie it all in. But if you're saying this new piece of information that was released in May, it's a bit hard,
Yeah. But do you go into it with an idea of what you want to write about each day, or are you literally... Because you were filing pretty much every day during the hearings, or were you literally picking up a thread each day? It
was a bit of a mix. I would do some research beforehand, see who was giving evidence. I gave some... Also, any sort of new reporters who came to the inquiry, like you were saying, it's quite... It's difficult to understand sort of what's going on and to sift through the documents and find what information is necessary. But in the opening statement of the counsel to the inquiry, there were really great summaries of all of the police witnesses. So I would always read that beforehand. If I saw that an officer had admitted that they had had a sexual relationship with a campaigner, then I'd be well, probably the line is going to be on this today.
Right, yeah.
But otherwise, sometimes it was completely random.
And just what jumped out at you while you were sat in the hearing room, basically, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it was when everyone around me went, oh,
Yeah. I mean, that must be a real difficulty because you kind of imagine that, I'm obviously, because you work with the Morning Star as opposed to any of the other press, you obviously have got a bit more to communicate with campaigners than most journalists would, and you do get that sort of feedback. But there's no other journalists there to sort of bounce off with at all. So you are really left to your wits on that one, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also the first inquiry I've covered a lot, so it's also been a bit of swimming in the deep end.
It's also one of those stories that you have to go back to brass tacks and reintroduce the story a lot.
Yeah, it gets quite frustrating to say the same part, but obviously you have to lay the context, otherwise people coming at it first won't know what's going on.
I mean, it's something we've been criticised with this podcast for doing, is that we just go straight to the deep end every time, but I kind of figure that if the Morning Star can't cover it without reintroducing it, somewhere has got to cover it without reintroducing it every 5 minutes. Do you know what I mean?
It's about your audience as well, though, I guess. I mean, your audience are probably people who are already quite clued out.
And I mean, but with the Morning Star readership is likely to be one which at least has a passing knowledge of this topic. But you still feel that reintroducing it each time is important, or is that something which is directed to you by your editors?
I guess it's just something you're taught. It's just sort of journalistic practice that you have to give context to what you're talking about.
Yeah, fair play.
Which I guess is frustrating for you guys. It's also takes away precious words that could be used to say new things.
So what kind of word, the word limit you're nearly always working to is what?
350 words.
350, Jesus, and there's so much detail to get in.
Yeah, I'm always trying to wrangle a long lead with my editors. Sometimes, a lot of the time, they say yes. Sometimes they're like, no.
Right, yeah.
You're not getting a long lead today, Bethany.
Well, thank you for fighting for it. You know what I mean? It is that's totally what we need. Given how much the outside of news, in the media generally, in drama and all that, police corruption, police misconduct, these are huge topics that are of great interest to the British public. Line of Duty is the most popular bloody thing on telly. Yeah, I mean, they're opening up state secrets about espionage. It's been mostly met with disinterest.
I suppose it kind of just goes down to the psyche of the British public, in that even though Line of Duty is one of the most popular shows, there's there's the good guys, the good police as well. People don't want to believe that a force like the police have been working against them to this degree for decades. Yeah, I was listening to actually a Times podcast the other day about some journalists who exposed police corruption in the Met in the 70s or something, and they opened their article by saying, "We say this information with great reluctance," or something, because they didn't want to. They had such faith in the police. I believe maybe it comes partly from that. I think it could also be that there's just been this, which might have also been fueled by this industrial infiltration of protest groups, but this sneering attitude towards campaigners. So I think a lot of journalists won't relate to what a lot of campaigners have been through, so it interests them less maybe, or somehow they feel like it must be warranted. And it's very easy for it to be spun by the police as just defending undercover policing as a whole. So maybe also there's less of this differentiation that's recognised by journalists to show that, it's on a completely different scale from an undercover police officer infiltrating a drug gang or a human trafficking gang. This is Stasi-style policing of just normal people trying to make a better world.
I mean that's part of it as well, is that it's treated like a crime story. So these are the police, that ergo those must be the criminals, or they're people who've been wrongly accused of being criminals. Well, no, they weren't wrongly accused; they really were. But those things shouldn't be a crime. It's a political story, yet no political journalists are covering it. It's crime journalists who are covering it. You know what I mean? That's the desk. That's it's never really crossed over into being a political story, apart from maybe a little where it led to the inquiry, right? I mean, that was the only time it was really reported on as a political story rather than a crime one.
Yeah.
Which.
Yeah, it's in the wrong box.
something like the Better Lives podcast, which is produced by the Telegraph. Well, the Telegraph's coverage of this issue has been non-existent until one of their journalists decided to put together a podcast about it, which was very much coming from a not lifestyle, but like it's a human interest story, right? It's not a political story, it's not a crime story, it's a human interest story, and like it's only coming from that's kind of got the coverage it warrants in that area, but that's still not telling the story of what actually.
It's not a wider picture, is it?
Right.
It's just these individual stories of the women, which is very important. But no, they would never do sort of like a podcast on the impact of potentially like of police spying on people who then got blacklisted. You know, like trade union activists.
Yeah.
That just wouldn't happen.
No,
but
not at all.
Their lives were devastated as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how did you find out about this as an issue, and what drew you to covering it?
I think what first made me aware of it was the stories of the women, and then what drew me to want to cover it is that this is an inquiry happening. In my lifetime was something I have control over being able to do. It's something that's very much of interest to our readership. And I think I had a feeling as well that it wasn't going to be covered so much by the general press. So someone kind of needed to be there. And I think it's just one of the most shocking things I've ever heard happen ever. And, when I go and speak to people in other countries about what's been happening here, their minds are blown. They're like, how has that happened? Yeah. I'm also involved in some like campaign groups, so I think just on a personal level as well. You can see how this has infected, the minds of people who want to campaign. There's so much distrust. There's so much sort of like looking at one another and thinking, you said something kind of strange the other day, does that mean that you might be doing this or that? And yeah, I think something that was so powerful that was said, in the opening statements back in phase 1 was like, and has kept being said, how has this, shaped society? What could have been achieved by all these groups had they not been infiltrated and had the seeds of doubt sowed? A lot of groups end up disbanding because they can't trust one another, or it kickstarts lots of other problems. And that's not even going into the whole, spy cops taking influential roles in groups and making decisions and all of that stuff. So yeah, it's interesting to me and important to me on that sort of personal level as well.
Do you see part of your role as reporting on that to that demystification element of it's not everybody's a spy cop, it's that like these were this person then, and like by pinning it down to like actual facts about it, it's kind of maybe hopefully inspires less paranoia in people. We know what they did, and this is how they operated, and this is maybe an idea of what you should worry about and what you shouldn't worry about. Yeah,
I suppose so. I mean, I think I also take the view that even though we do now know the tactics, and you through this reporting and through what's being found out of the inquiry, groups can kind of arm themselves or protect themselves against these, but I just assume that now those tactics have changed.
But the information they're interested in won't have. How they when we're looking at the reports, we see that so much of it's about networking. It's just names and addresses and occupations. That's a huge part of what the reports are. And though the tactics to get those information will have changed, it's the information they're after. That's what they're bothered about.
How would you protect yourself against that? Them harvesting that information.
I mean, I don't know as you can necessarily protect yourself, but that to be aware that's the thing that's the thing you should be worried about. Kind of keeping an eye on your membership lists and all that kind of stuff. That's what they're going to be going for, right? Those kind of things. What is sensitive information? Well, sensitive information is personal interactions and not being paranoid about everything else. One of the things that's really common, I think, for people who are really concerned about infiltration is they dial down the rhetoric. You can't say that, I'm being listened to, I can't say. That's not something to worry about. What's to worry about is that I'm meeting up with that person, which means I'm do you know what I mean? It's that there's no reason to dial down your rhetoric. That's not going to save you or make any bloody difference either way.
It's more about identities and stuff and addresses and
yeah. And who knows who, and who else knows those people.
Yeah. Now we've got Pegasus and all this stuff anyway, so there's a whole new level of scary. Maybe undercover officers are not... Well, no, they would still want to use them. But
I think it's that thing of, like, I'm sure that covert methods have changed significantly due to, technological advancements,
yeah.
right? But it's not about algorithms. I mean, there's still individuals behind that technology. Maybe those people don't need to be in your life anymore. Maybe they just spy on you through your phone and through, like, CCTV cameras or whatever else, or however they're monitoring people. But you've still got individual officers assigned to you because of your involvement in activism. Maybe they're just not in your life in the way in which you can see their face. Or maybe not. I mean, that's a complete guess. I mean, what we do know is that as we're like entering what is the era of neoliberal policing, that there's a greater use of private contractors to do things, and I'm sure that the informer estate, as it basically is, that huge numbers of people who are informers for the police, who maybe are people who say exactly what they say they are, but are collecting information.
Yeah, for money.
For money, yeah, and I'm sure that is
being blackmailed or something.
Yeah, maybe blackmail or maybe professionally. You know what I mean? They actually are contractors. We certainly know that that's where a lot of the undercover police went on to do, was to work in private security. And I mean, these are things which don't get covered by the inquiry, right? Which are very linked to do with, like, corporate espionage, and we have to look at something like the London Greenpeace. How many people in that were undercover deployments from, like, McDonald's themselves, from the police. It's like,
Yeah, and you're right. The link between the two, the sort of a revolving door. Even from when we were hearing in the first phase, I think, about a manager in one of the special branch units going off and working for the Economics League blacklist firm. Different from state espionage, but sorry, from corporate espionage, but
like Mark Kennedy went on, he was working for Global Open.
Yeah, I guess as well in Mark Kennedy's case, he was addicted to that lifestyle, wasn't he?
Right.
He needed to continue it, but then it was his undoing because they didn't have his back, like, in the same way as the police.
Right, totally, absolutely.
Organised. Yeah.
So it was they were on borrowed time with the techniques because of the modern information age we're living in. You know what I mean? Everybody's got this huge digital imprint, which obviously they would be unable to maintain. Maybe you can fake those things. Maybe they fake those things now. It's hard to know, isn't it?
They do that in the films, but I don't
You're
know.
right. Well, I mean, if we've learned anything from this process, is that, like, they're very heavily influenced by films. The Jackal Run and all that. From Day of the Jackal, in the inquiry process, where
and he admitted it.
He admitted it, but then also it was said, "Oh, is that just because it was a term, you used the terminology?" No, it was from the film.
Which must be absolutely horrible for the families to hear, because that's what they were saying in their witness statement, that they had suspicions that it wasn't like, the result of any operational necessity to justify the use of this really extreme and abusive tactic, but it was merely inspired by a film.
And they were so, like, unrepentant. I mean, it's one of those things that I kind of feel like this would be a bigger story if people could witness this, them actually giving the evidence,
Yeah, especially the very expressionate ones. Yeah, it was very obvious how little remorse they really didn't think there was any problem with that tactic. I think there was a few who said that they did regret it or they refused to do it, but I never really believe when they say things like that. It's just they know how badly people think of that now. But yeah, it's very interesting to see these people. Like, I was very interested to see the spy cops in the flesh. Like, well, not in the flesh because it was through a screen.
Yeah.
But especially like the ones, well, all of them, but the 1968 to 1972, they were there at the inaugural meeting sort of thing. Conrad Dixon, and it's like, you were the founders of something so horrific that went on to just bulldoze your way through so many people's lives, and I'm looking at you now, and very interesting. But then they were pretty boring because they didn't say anything interesting. Like,
if you when you do cover it in any sort of depth, it's kind of boring just to say how much. I don't remember, not sure. When it is.
Yeah, when I look through my notes, I think I gave myself sort of like abbreviations and things for. I have absolutely no recollection of that. That means absolutely nothing to me, And it it was sometimes quite hard to scrape a story out of things because maybe just out of their denial of certain things, or times when you really felt, there were a lot of times when campaigners, you guys in the room, were saying, they had an excellent memory for these very minute details of things, but then when it came to something that was a bit more incriminating, magically they lost their memory of it.
I think it's so blatant that not just the lying, but the kind of the faulty memory. The way that nobody was there when Blair Peach died. Nobody was there that day. There was 18 officers at any of those major anti-fascist demonstrations, and then one of the biggest ones, one of the most notorious ones. None of them were there. Well, one was, but we don't even get to hear his evidence. In fact, in the case of that officer, we don't even have a cipher with which to refer to him to. There's not even a HN number.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that feels like for for everyone who, really wants answers and had the fingers of the state all, in all their lives.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I think this story is bigger than those who are affected by it, because it affects all of us, because like you say, it had a profound impact on the kind of country that Britain is now. So we were all infiltrated by undercover cops. Britain was infiltrated by undercover cops. Our society was. It's really, I think, part of the reason, I don't know if it's part of the reason, but there's a certain element of some sort of ownership of the issue by those who were the worst affected.
Because I guess that's with any traumatic event. You see that's how things play out. This sort of sense of ownership of that problem, or not wanting to take on such a big role because you're like, oh, that person had it worse. So it's not how it comes across to people on the outside, such as myself, but it's your lives. So I don't know. It must be, you're really in it.
The majority of people who are affected haven't really spoken up much because, like you say, it's all about trauma, and a lot of people, when at the very beginning, particularly, nobody wanted to tell their story publicly. Nobody wanted to go out and do that. That was the last thing anybody wanted to do. But it was tactically, we're going to have to. That's the
change.
Yeah, you're going to have to parade your story out there so that people can connect on a human level with what these deployments were all about, which kind of sucks, to be honest.
Yeah, I can imagine. You don't want people knowing all your shit.
In terms of telling the story, do you think, as a journalist, do you think we're missing any tricks on that front?
I would say the only trick is, people relate so much to seeing something played out in front of their eyes, as in a Netflix series. Not in terms of journalism, but there's so many historic injustices that have been dramatized in recent years. The Chicago 7.
Sure,
and I always forget the name of this series, but the boys who were wrongly accused of raping a woman, and they were jailed for a really long time, and it was all tied up with massive racism.
Is that the American one? Oh, I don't know. There's so bloody many. Miscarriage of justice stuff is...
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah. There's the Cardiff 3, that's a similar thing,
But, that really showed it in such a, painful way that touched anyone who watched it. And after that, the police officer who really pushed for these poor boys to be locked up when they were innocent, she lost all her book deals. And
Right.
It doesn't mean she's in jail or anything, but...
Yeah. To me, one of the things I think is that we kind of got hung up on telling the stories when the real story is bigger than just what happened to us as individuals. It's what's happened to the country, right? What's happened to our democracy, such as it is, and maybe our understanding of British history ought to be modified slightly.
Yeah, well, it's interesting things that have come out, like a spy cop trying to get John Lennon, to play at the Troops Out movement gig, and there will be all of these, prominent British figures, historical British figures, whose lives will have been touched by these operations. I guess people knew that John Lennon had a special branch file before as well. Anyway, the wider thing is it is difficult to communicate, and for that to be sort of a daily story that someone would write about. Yes. It has to sort of be more an individual or a particularly shocking fact that comes out. But in terms of sort of long form journalism, I mean, there's definitely that should be a story.
Like the institutional sexism, right? Do you know what I mean? It's not just about the spy cops. It's about the police in general, and the way in which the police have a culture that's more than willing to use women in that way.
I think there is definitely more of a awareness and understanding now of police attitudes about women and willingness to use violence or to ignore. We have like plummeting rape conviction and prosecution rates. The Sarah Everard case, which obviously just brought all of that into focus. Being a police officer who murdered her. And a lot of groups have now like either been reinvigorated or have been created, and they want to highlight this. And to tie then from you guys to tie your stories in with that as well. I mean, there were reports when people were talking about wider sexism in the police that spoke about the deception of female campaigners by undercover police officers. But it should have been an example that every single newspaper used when talking about this earlier in the year.
You intend to keep covering this story, right?
Yep.
Like you're in it for the long haul?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, and it will be the long haul because it's a long inquiry. It's
going to be a long inquiry, yeah. And and also I think like the story is longer than the inquiry. I mean, other things I think will come out afterwards. I mean, we kind of joke the first public inquiry into undercover policing, because I don't think.
Yeah, the Daniel Morgan thing's probably quite a bad omen for everyone who wants to get fast justice, because it's like 5 inquiries later. For how many years later? 40.
Yeah. Well, 34 years. Yeah.
34.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like ridiculous, but that's the speed of British justice. And I mean, even now, like the family's been vindicated with the independent panel report, but there's still no justice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the next phases of the inquiry will be very interesting, because it then goes into sort of closer to the time, the more sort of notorious undercover officers. I think there'll be a lot more press attention at that time.
I think, certainly when we get to people like Andy Coles, Bob Lambert, people with a profile anyway, they are academics or politicians in their own right, as well as having this past.
Definitely. Yeah. And I've always found, since the beginning, that there's sort of two main things about the inquiry in terms of reporting on it, which is, the evidence and police witnesses, everything coming out of the inquiry itself, and then the way that it's being conducted, and the frustrations that the non-state court participants have about how it's being conducted, and your fight for transparency. I kind of see all the live tweeting everyone's doing is just sort of your fight that you've taken, as well as being involved because you want answers yourself, but you've also taken on sort of the burden in a way to make an inquiry that's supposed to be public. So that's also an interesting point that I've noticed, covering it since October, and something that I probably wouldn't have then also picked up on had I not been around covering it physically. Yeah. So, yeah, and that just has a the way it's kind of being concealed from view, it's important on a wider scale as well for just how inquiries can be done in this country. And it's something that everyone should sort of be looking at as well as what's coming out of it, all the evidence, the way it's being conducted. People should also be looking at that.
It's great that you're coming to the inquiry, but not only that, like, it was during COVID, and it was during, like, the first set of hearings were during, like, full lockdown in London. It was a very surreal time to be attending.
Second lockdown.
Yeah, something like that. So, it's been even more challenging than it was going to be anyway to cover. So, thank you so much for, like, making the bloody effort, because I would imagine you could have filled, like, the Morning Star would have been happy with you doing something else. It wasn't like, I get the impression it was your choice as much as it was your editor's choice to cover this story, right?
Yeah, a mix. If I had, my former colleague Conrad, he always covered these things. If he had been there, he would have also been very insistent. And like Solomon Hughes as well, a feature writer, regular feature writer, he uncovered a lot. I saw his name in a lot of the documents, because he had uncovered a lot of things through Freedom of Information requests. Yeah,
the Special Branch Files website, that's him. Yeah.
But yeah, so the history is there with the paper.
Yeah, very much, right. And I mean, like, the paper is, we haven't heard it come up in anything so far, but the idea that the paper itself wouldn't have been watched in some way by covert policing is, of course it would have been at some point on some level.
Yeah, we used to always make jokes in the office when we were in the office before COVID times that, your MI5 is listening to you right now, like, be careful what you say. Because, it definitely happened in the past, anyone with links to the Communist Party.
Oh, very much, absolutely. That's the original kind of bogeyman, right?
Exactly, the original target.
Yeah, totally.
And there was do you remember, I think it was like in the first phase when they were getting inspiration, like the early SDS, and it was a woman that infiltrated the Communist Party in the 30s or the 20s or something.
Yeah.
And they were moaning about how she'd asked to increase her salary, and then they let her go.
Yeah.
She dared to ask for a bit more money or something. That was random.
Things like that, they kind of delve into the psyche of what these people are like, and this really odd worldview that they've got about, like, you really see it with, like, the highest calling of the police is to defend the Queen's peace. This kind of thing of, like,
there's archaic language just coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was one as well. I think it was Epps. Epps.
Dick Epps.
He was saying, like, he basically considered himself and them as, like, the guardians on the edge of the galaxy. No, the guardians on the edge of society.
Yeah. Not the Marvel comic. Yeah.
That was very telling.
If only.
It's the thin blue line sort of mentality, but even worse.
Yeah. They're fucking nuts, mate. They're all fucking nuts.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, and, like, please, like, join us again. At the very least, for the next phase, come and do another episode, if not before. If there's anything you want to, stay in touch. Thanks for joining us. If you're listening this far, then, like, you probably know, but please check out spycops.info, where you can find all our previous episodes. And if you're able to give us a 5-star review on your podcast provider, that really helps our visibility. It's so bad, isn't it? That bit, no, laugh away, dude. I hate it. I hate that thing. I don't want to be that guy saying, like, comment, subscribe. But that's what you're kind of meant to do if you're doing podcasts.
It's just reminding me of the 5-star thing of, like, don't give me 4 stars. You give me a 4-star, you might as well give me a 1-star.
Exactly, yes. Don't give us a 4-star. Don't be that guy. Well said. This Thursday we'll be going live on Twitter Spaces. #SpyCopsPod to find it on Twitter Spaces. It's this Thursday. If you're not listening to this when it first comes out, then maybe it'll be this Thursday anyway. Check out #SpyCopsPod. I don't know, we might still be doing it. Hopefully, that's the idea.